and so we'll do that on Monday. But I'd like to discuss the database designer, and that will get us into the last part of Chapter 18. Want to talk about what we'll be doing next week, show you the project because I've started on it. Unfortunately, I didn't get as far as I wanted to get, but at least I'll be able to show you what we're going to be doing. All right. Now, this morning I sent you an email that's got 2 articles in it. Hopefully you remember this. When we were working on the, let's see if I can even find it. Morning. Well, I can't find it right now, but you remember when we made the diagram that we did for all of our databases, and we showed how we can put them together. All right. And I showed you one way of doing it. I sent you an article this morning on another way that it can be done. Notice SQL Server database has got a diagram tool in it. And this walks you through so you can come out to database diagrams, create a new one, add as many tables or as few as you want to, specify relationships like primary keys, etc., and then put them into a diagram. Tell it that you want it to arrange them, and it'll look something like this. But it looks familiar to what you saw before. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I haven't used that tool, but it's another one if you are interested in it. The one that we will talk about right now and what we'll talk about today, I was online and looked at and for a lot of different articles on how to use the data designer, and there's a lot of really bad ones out there. This is right from Microsoft itself. It's a little dated. It's about 3 years old, all right, or 2.5, whatever. But they explain in here how you can create a new data set. Now, I want to show you quickly what I did yesterday, okay? And that is, and I worked on it a little bit this morning as well. This is what we're going to work on next week. So the idea is this is going to be our main page. We're going to have 9 forms in this project. And when it comes up, it'll look like this. If you click this button, it's going to bring up the customers table, all right? If you click this button, it's going to bring up the employees table, the orders table, etc. I don't have to read them to you. Hopefully that all just makes sense. All right. So that's what we're going to work on. And of course, then there's an exit button here. Then what we're going to have for each one of these, so I'm just going to walk you through them. So notice if I go to customers, what it looks like. It's going to have the data grid view on it. It's going to have all the other buttons, except since this is the customers table, this will say home. And then you've got the other ones. When I go to the employees table, it looks similar, except now we got customers. It says home where employees was, etc. And then we go to orders. Then we go to order details. Then we go to categories. All right, then we go to products, to product vendors, and then finally to vendors. So that's what we're going to work on next week. I'm not sure exactly, I will work on it somewhat this week, but I want us to be able to jump back and forth between forms and be able to look at all of the data at any one time. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, so that's what we'll work on next week. Now, so what does that have to do with anything? Well, once I added all of the tables, not like just one like we added before, but once I added all of the tables, what I got, amongst other things, if you can look on the screen here, and I realize it doesn't resonate that big here, but there's a thing here that says sales orders dataset.xsd. That's the schema definition. And if I double click on it, well, that's some code. I don't really care about that, to be honest with you, but I double clicked on the wrong one. I don't want the designer. I want to click right on the thing itself that says sales orders dataset.xsd. That look familiar? Now, I didn't move them around very much, so it doesn't, the order isn't exactly the same order as what we saw before. But what I want you to realize is what this shows is something pretty important. This has got all 8 of our tables on it. And you'll notice that for each table, it shows what the primary key or keys is or are. It shows all of the elements that are inside of here. And it also shows right now the only methods that are associated with these. And you'll notice with each one it says fill data. Because again, and you already know this, but as soon as I put in a data grid view, and I add it manually myself, and the way I added these, just so you can see this if you look up on the screen, I went and highlighted the particular table, just dragged it out like they talked about in class. And it was in the book when we went over the lecture yesterday. So that's what we have. I did take the time to make all the buttons the same size, make all these labels the same size, make the data grid view the same size, just because I wanted it to look a little bit more uniform. What I'm going to try to do over the weekend is to write generic routines that it's going to allow us to click on any button and go from whatever form we're currently on to that particular form. The only one right now when you run it that works is probably the one you would think about, and that is the exit button. Other than that, nothing else in here right now works. All right, so one of my goals by Monday is to make the rest of them work. All right, and have this available, and I'm just going to give it to you. Now, I'm not going to require that you key it in or anything else. I'm going to give you the code for this. Now, what have we done in here this week? All right, well, if you remember, we wrote a couple simple apps. In other words, we went in and we took all of the customer fields, we dragged them out onto a form individually. After we dragged them out, and remember it came with the labels too, we got rid of some of the labels, prettied it up a little bit, and we could run it and go through the entire customer's table. We also added a first, a previous, a next, and a last button. I gave you the code for those. I want you to key those in. I want you to do that one. I want you to do the other one we did as well, which is the one that we did using the wizard. And I want you to do the SQL tester that we did as a class yesterday. I'm not that concerned with you having a ton of comments, but I want that done, and I want that in a week from today. That's going to suffice for your labs/homework for Chapter 18. Does that make sense to everybody? Questions? All right. So again, the one that we're going to be working on next is the one that I just showed you, and that will get us into Chapter 19. All right? So before we even talk about that, let's go back to the book and let's finish up Chapter 18 that we've been going over. All right? Now, I just very quickly showed you the data set designer. All right? You saw a picture of it. You're going to have that on your screen as well. If you want to know, well, what do each of these components do? How did you get that out there, etc.? How would I create my own if I wanted to? That's in this article right here that I sent you this morning. Notice, create a new data set by using the data source configuration wizard. So you can walk through the entire process. We already did this where we chose our database as our type. We already set up our connection. In here, if you choose multiple tables, and I chose them all, if you look on the screen here, so I just literally ticked this one right here that said tables. And then when I did that, it created this data set for me. Now, ours isn't Northwind as they're using here. Ours is sales orders. All right. And it explains how you can move things around, how you can use them, what everything there is for, how you can look at and possibly set up relationships. This I mentioned to you yesterday. If you remember, I talked to you about referential integrity. And I said referential integrity means that if you're going to kill parent records, what do you do with the children? And I said it is possible that when you remove the parents, you can get rid of the children, or you can set them all to null, or, as they say here, you can set them to a default value. All right, and they explain that in here also. All right, then they talk to you about a couple of other things. Now, there's actually something in here that I wanted to mention to you. All right, and that is when you go in and you manually set these things up. We're still not manually doing that yet. I just dragged and dropped and put in those data grid views. All right, but when you manually set things up, if you want to manually let the system know that, for example, your ID field, all right, your ID field is auto increment, there is an auto increment thing that's in here. All right, and we'll take a look at that in another class period. Okay. So like I said, they run through this with you. I'm not going to say anything more about it. Hopefully that makes at least a little bit of sense. You'll notice that when you bring this up here, it says add new data source, which we've already seen, and edit data set with designer. That's what we're going to be looking at a little bit today and more starting next week. All right. So it's only about 8 pages, probably be done lecturing by around 8:45. So you're going to have 3 hours today to work on whatever. All right. So if you have not yet done these programs, these 3 programs that we went and did as a class, you'll have time to do that. All right. And if you have not yet looked at the written test for Chapter 18, you'll have time to do that. So again, on Monday of next week, we will go over the written test first thing for Chapter 18. Then I will begin going over Chapter 19. Talk about that in just a minute. So it says here, the dataset designer lets you work with a database or dataset schema using a graphical interface. So again, right now, if you've got only one table, that's what it's going to look like, because there's only one table. All right, so we chose customers before, so that basically is what our XML schema definition would look like. Not really very much. So normally you're going to include more than one table. All right, so as it says, for each table, the dataset schema includes the table adapter that lists the queries that can be used with a table. So down here, if you look on the screen here, that's the table adapter. And you'll notice it's automatically named for us too. It says customers table adapter. All right. Now it says each table adapter includes at least a main query method named fill. You can also go in, and this is what we're going to be doing soon. You can generate your own insert, update, and delete. So right now with fill, that's the read or the C part, the read or the select statement part. That's all we're doing. All right, we aren't doing the C in CRUD, which is create, the U in CRUD, which is update, and the D in CRUD, which is delete. We'll start getting into that next week. And as it says in here, you can use this query to generate insert, update, and delete statements. In addition, it says you can write your own customized queries. So for instance, if you didn't want to show every product, but maybe you only wanted to show every product under the bikes category, you could write, your own customized queries and put them in there too. As it says, if you click on a table adapter in the DataSite Designer, you'll see its properties in the properties window. What does that mean? That means if you click right here, if you click on this right here, you're going to see stuff in the properties window that's associated with it. That's what, like I said, what we're going to be getting into more next week. All right. It says, note that the dataset designer also makes it easy to set properties for a column in the table. So if you want to change the width, the color, or whatever, you can do that. Now, it also says in here, you can use this technique to set the default property. Well, again, I've given you this example before. We don't have it in what we're working on here, but if we wanted to set a default state to Missouri, this is where we could do it. That kind of an idea. So I'm not going to read this to you, but they show you the dataset designer right here, and they explain how you can view it and what you can do with it right here. I just basically hit the high points with you right now. All right. So then it says, what if you want to build your own queries? Like I said, right now when you use the dataset designer, the bad thing about it, so to speak, is it does a select star from the table name. Does that make sense to everybody? It shows you every record in the table, every record and every field in every record. Well, sometimes that's not what you want. All right? So it says you can't specify a sort sequence, for example. You can't join 2 or more tables, as an example. It says the easiest way to do this, if you want to, is to use the query builder. This query builder, and I mentioned this to you yesterday, is very similar to the query builder that comes with Microsoft Access. And when you look at it, it's broken up into what are called panes. There is 1, 2, 3, 4 panes. So there are 4 panes in this window. The first one is the diagram pane. You can bring in as many tables in here as you want to. So if I wanted to add another table, I can literally just click in here to tell it to add another table. Everything that's checked automatically becomes part of my query. So you'll notice we've got customer ID, name, address, and city. So we've got select customer ID, comma, name, comma, address, comma, city. They've also got state and zip. They're checked. You just can't see them in here. All right. This is the grid pane. So you can tell it that you want to select all these, but you can put in here, for example, if for whatever reason I didn't want to show the ID, I could check right here and I could tell it, yeah, I want it to include the ID, but I don't want it to show. All right, this is the SQL query that gets generated, and as it says here, this is the results pane. All right, so if you need a better explanation than what I just gave you, I don't want to read to you. It's all right here on the previous page. They talk about the grid pane, they talk about the SQL pane, they talk about the results pane. They also explain about them a little bit more right in here. We will be doing some of this starting in Chapter 19 when we go in and start writing our own customized queries. And why, again, why do you do that? Well, for example, if I have 935 orders, there's probably a pretty good chance when I come in, I don't want to see all 935. For example, I might want to just see the ones that were placed this month. So I might want them where an order date begins with, you know, it's the year 2021 and it begins with the 4th month. All right, type of thing. All right. Says after you create a query, you can use the dataset designer to preview the data that it retrieves. The reason that you might want to preview it is, you know, typically if you're going to go to all the trouble of creating this query, you'll want to save it. But before you save it, you'll want to go in and you'll want to make sure that it's giving you the results that you want. All right. So there's an example. As it says, it's the preview data dialog box. So if you decided, oh, I really don't want the customer ID, you could go back in again, remove the customer ID, and then run this again. Or if you notice it right now, it is ordered by customer ID. If you wanted it ordered by something else, you could do that. All right. Now notice, because they give you a little preview here for Chapter 19. It says, in the next chapter, you'll learn how to create queries that use parameters. The idea with a parameter, again, is that you can write queries on the fly. So what I can do is I can, for example, I could make a text box, and in that text box, I could, for example, I could put in a product. And then I could tell the system, well, I only want you to show me all the sales details regarding this product. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to literally create query parameters. We're going to be using things like just using a question mark so that while the program's running, we can write queries that will execute on the fly, and we can change the information while the program's actually running. All right? And that's what they talk about in here. So again, if you want more on this displaying the preview data box, you can take a look at it. Okay? We will be taking a look at it in a little bit more depth and breadth of coverage, as I mentioned, starting next week. And then finally, because I think this is just about it, right? Yep. How to interpret the generated SQL statements. The fill, by now at least, hopefully, is pretty easy for you to understand. We also have that SQL tester program, so you could always take the stuff that you end up creating here, and you could rewrite it, all right, or write something similar in that SQL Query Tester. Now, when you look in here, notice these @ signs. All right, these @ signs basically means these are things that can potentially change so that I can run the program, I can run a query, and if I didn't get the results I was looking for, while the program is still up and running, I could just make some changes to my query. All right, so again, these @ signs that you see, and they're not the question mark, I was thinking of the wrong DBMS. In some DBMSs, rather than using the @ sign, they use the question mark. All right, but you can see what happens in here. Name equals original name, address equals original address, etc. So it says here, by default, this data source configuration wizard adds code to the where clause when you do an update and when you do a delete. Notice it says it checks that the data hasn't changed since it was retrieved. What does that mean? That means, again, if we're all sharing the same database and two of us have the same table open at the same time, so if Aaron and I both have the same table open and he has changed it since I have worked, since I have brought this up, it's not, this query is not going to work. I'm going to be told basically to close the table and open it again because the table is out of date. All right. As it says, by default, the data source configuration wizard adds a select statement after the insert and updates to refresh the new or modified row. So you always get the most important data. And that brings me to one more thing, because we're just about finished. But I want to mention this because you're going to hear it in this class. You're going to hear it in other classes you take. All right. And that is that when you work with this stuff, it has to pass what's called the ACID test. ACID is an acronym that stands for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. All right, let's just quickly go over what each parts of this mean. Atomicity means that quite often what you're going to do is, as a professional database designer, developer, person who works with it, you're going to create transactions. Now, maybe you've never done what I'm about to tell you. Maybe you have. But let's assume for a second that you've got to write some bills. All right, you got to pay some bills. I don't care if you still write checks. I don't care how you do it. And let's say that rather than a debit, you've got a savings account, you've got a checking account. All right? And you realize that you don't have enough money in your checking account to go and cover all the checks that you want to write. So you want to move some money from your savings account to your checking account. That makes sense to everybody? Now you get to the bank and you find out it's Saturday and you thought they were open till 2. Okay, it's 12:30 and they closed at 12. So you go in and you manually go up to the ATM and you tell it to transfer, let's say $500 from your savings account to your checking account. Well, you want to make sure that that works, right? Because if you're going to write checks or do whatever, you want to make sure you've got enough money in your account that it's going to handle it. What you don't want to have happen is you don't want to put that in and think that it worked and then find out that it didn't and the money is still in savings, write checks which would end up being bad checks. So what this is saying is typically what will happen is if you want to do 5 things, you'll bundle them up into what's called a transaction. And the transaction must totally succeed or it all fails. So if you're telling it to do 5 things, and number 1 is fine, number 2 is fine, number 3 is fine, number 4 is fine, number 5 fails, it gets what's called rolled back. And none of the first 4 things take effect. All right? Then is consistency. Well, your data must always be in what's called a consistent state. So think about if you were at the doctor's office and you moved. So you had a new address, maybe you moved to a new city, but let's just say you're in the same state. So let's say you move from, I don't know, O'Fallon to Wentzville. All right, so your address has changed, your city has changed, your zip code has changed. You want to make sure that when you make those changes, they all take effect. In other words, you don't want it where you're missing an address. All right, you want to make sure that the data in the database always stays in a consistent state. All right. Isolation. It says no transaction should be affected by any other transaction. You've already looked at this, or we've talked about it. And I used that concurrency idea. And I said that if I'm changing a table and we're all sharing the same database and Christopher is changing the same table and he has made a change to a record in there, okay, and then he got out. Well, if I go in to change the same record, my data is no longer in isolation. All right. In other words, he's changed something. So my attempt to change it is going to fail. I'm going to get an error message, and it's going to say I have to close the table and reopen it to get the latest and greatest data. All right. Finally, durability. And that says that once you go in and you make a change, that change stays there. So once you've made a change and it's been written out, even if a couple minutes later the system crashes, those changes have already taken effect. So again, it's very important. It's a thing you're going to hear a lot if you go to work in databases, this concept of ACID. All right. So then finally, it says here the SQL statements use parameters. This is a parameter. Anything that starts with an @ sign is a parameter. And you'll notice that the parameters in here all appear on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of the equal sign. All right? So we are grabbing those and copying them into something. So this, for example, if I had an update option in my customers table, and I went and changed everything that was in each one of those text boxes, and then ran this, it would grab that what's in the name text box, copy it to the name database field, the address in the text box to the address in the database, etc. All right, so whether I'm doing an update, or I'm doing a delete, or I'm doing an insert, so regardless of which of these CRUD operations, the C, the U, and the D I'm doing, we want to make sure that the data that it works and the data stays in a consistent state. So it says here, the SQL statements use parameters to identify the new values for an insert or an update. They're also used for the original column values, which are used to check that the row hasn't changed. We already talked about that. And one is used in the where clause of the select. All right, the values for these parameters are stored in and retrieved from the data set, so from the database itself. All right, so notice, because we don't normally go through this, it's just a paragraph, it says you should be able to use a data source to create simple applications. That's where we are right now. That's what we've done so far. All right, so when we get into the next chapter next week, we're going to notice it says how to work with bound controls and parameterized queries. So you'll notice again, this is broken up into a few sections. So we'll, as we have been doing, we might go through 1, 2, or 3 sections the first day, and then 1, 2, or 3 the second day, or we might break it up even more than that. But it says in here, now you learn some additional skills for building database applications. Specifically, you learn how to work with bound controls. Don't worry about what they are right now, but if you can, if you've got the time, page through this. It's what? It's about 30 pages. All right, just page through it and look at the high points on the left-hand side. Look at the examples on the right-hand side. Even if you spend 15 minutes on it, it'll make it easier for you to understand. All right, we will learn how to customize the toolbar that gets generated. Maybe you want to add more things onto that toolbar. Maybe you don't want to allow anybody to remove anything from there. So you want to remove that X that does the delete. Maybe when it does the delete, maybe you want to ask a question. Are you sure you want to do this type of an idea? And we'll talk some more about working with the data grid view. One of the things I'm going to do, and I haven't really looked at theirs, but I'm going to look at their code that's in here. And if I figure that, I'm still going to show you mine, and we're going to write that and work with that. But if their code, if this example in here looks good, maybe we'll go through that example also. All right? That's, like I said, all I had. I figured it would only take about 30 to 45 minutes. So the rest of the period is yours. I've already given you plenty of stuff that you can work on. If you get all that done, all right, you want to work on your gen eds, etc., totally fine. All right? Questions? All right, then the rest of the period is yours.